March of 2012, 12,500 feet deep in the North Atlantic, a robotic camera glided through the first class of the Titanic. The light revealed a corridor consumed by time until it stopped before an anomaly. The door to cabin B-52 was perfectly closed. More than a century of crushing pressure had failed to tear it down. But the detail that would have paralyzed researchers was not the endurance of the wood. According to the version passed down through the years, the equipment recorded that the lock kept the internal safety latch engaged. Someone, in those final minutes of April, had turned the deadbolt from the inside while the sea claimed the ship. And that is where the mystery begins, because the story told about that room insists it was completely empty. The first class of the largest ship in the world was designed to be a haven of opulence and tranquility. On the night of April 14, 1912, the corridors of B deck still showcased carved wood paneling and the soft lighting that preceded the passengers' rest. Everything there represented the pinnacle of human engineering and comfort. Today, that exact same space rests in pitch-black darkness, consumed by the unforgiving currents of the ocean floor. Much of that luxurious structure was damaged beyond repair when the vessel suffered a colossal rupture, breaking in half moments before vanishing beneath the surface for good. But the door to cabin B-52 held strong, against all odds, and the fact that it was locked from the inside creates a paradox, one that the narrative tries to decipher in absolute silence. We know with remarkable precision what happened to most of the cabins in that sector. We know who occupied them, what they were doing, and the exact path they walked when the order to abandon ship echoed across the upper decks. The company's records were meticulous. They mapped every passenger, every ticket, and every piece of luggage checked at departure in Southampton. And woven into the thread of this story, cabin B-52 emerges as a void, a lifeless, nameless space which should have been easily breached and torn wide open by the sheer force of the freezing water that slowly swallowed the corridors. Yet, the image that reached that specific hallway shatters that certainty. The latch was engaged in a way that demanded a human hand, a deliberate act, driven by panic, by dread, or by the sheer instinct to isolate oneself from the growing chaos that was beginning to overtake the ocean liner, which leads us to a flaw in what became accepted as truth, or perhaps an omission. Exploring the mystery of cabin B-52 is not just looking at a piece of preserved wood in the deep. It is opening a file that imagination has kept sealed. It means confronting discrepancies in century-old documents and trying to understand who that nameless person was. The person who, in the final moments of one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century, made the conscious choice to lock the door. The silence surrounding this room has lasted for decades in our history, and the pieces of this puzzle involve altered manifests, unclaimed baggage, and the testimony left behind by a crew member who saw far more than he should have that early morning. The darkness at 12,500 feet deep is absolute. There is no natural light, and the extreme water pressure of the Atlantic Ocean has turned the Titanic's reinforced steel into an unrecognizable landscape across several of its sections. Remotely operated vehicles, controlled with pinpoint accuracy through long, thin cables, are the only human eyes capable of penetrating the wreckage resting on the seabed. Everything down there is deadly silent and blanketed in sediment. It was in this hostile environment that, following the trail of James Cameron's expeditions to the wreck, a robotic camera ventured into the depths of B-deck. The goal was to map the decay of the luxury cabins and salvage the visual memory of what remained of that floating palace. Navigation was incredibly cautious. The small unmanned subs had to dodge severed wires, corroded metal structures, and debris that crumbled at the slightest shift in the water. The salinity, the immense pressure, and the iron-eating bacteria have heavily degraded the organic materials, severely weakening the framework over the course of more than a century. But gliding slowly down that once exquisite first-class hallway, the high-definition lens hit a physical barrier, one that defied the logic of everything surrounding the sunken vessel. The oak door of cabin B-52. It was entirely in one piece, and even more surprisingly, it was perfectly closed, tightly fitted into its original frame. To grasp the true magnitude of this detail, you have to understand the destructive physics of the event. When the ocean liner went down in the bitter chill of that April morning, seawater flooded the corridors with indescribable brute force. The crushing weight and flow of the water shattered glass, blew out partition walls, and forced open heavy doors to equalize the massive pressure inside the ship's compartments. The vast majority of cabin doors were ripped from their hinges or simply disintegrated over time, eaten away by marine organisms that bore into the wood. Finding an intact cabin door standing strong against the abyssal currents for a century would be a fascinating structural anomaly in its own right, and the story goes deeper than the wood. According to the established account, the door's resilience wasn't just due to exceptional British craftsmanship or a mere fluke of the ocean currents. The brass doorknob, coated in a thin layer of deep-sea sludge, displayed an undeniable detail. The lock kept the internal safety latch completely engaged. The lock mechanisms of that era were heavy-duty. They required a manual, mechanical, and intentional turn. The cabin safety latch could not be triggered by a jolt, by the ship's bow slamming into the ocean floor, or by the relentless turbulent rush of salt water. For the metal pin of that lock to be resting in that exact locked position, one single condition had to be met: a human hand. Someone had to be inside cabin B-52. Someone, using their own fingers, turned the heavy safety latch from the inside, locking themselves in that luxury suite, all while the situation spiraled completely out of control outside. Surrounded by the terrifying sounds of buckling metal, boilers venting steam to relieve the pressure, and the freezing water rising relentlessly through the stairwells and lower decks. And it is right there, in the tiny mechanical pin of a brass lock, that underwater physics collides head-on with the paperwork, creating a standoff that has fascinated experts for more than a century, because there would be no surprise at all if the cabin were harboring a terrified passenger. Human fear, the sheer dread of freezing water, or simply the refusal to leave the room in the face of the unknown. Those things easily explain the drastic act of locking oneself inside to wait things out. The real knot, the one tying this entire story together, is the repeated claim. The claim that, according to the shipping line's boarding records, there was absolutely no one inside. To understand how this standoff came to be, we have to go back in time, returning to June of 1912. It was the immediate aftermath of the disaster, when investigations and boards of inquiry were desperately trying to make sense of that night's chaos. The company responsible for the Titanic had to provide an exact accounting of who was on board and where each passenger was supposed to be staying, and in the version we inherited, the status of suite B-52 was declared unequivocally to the authorities. The cabin was vacant. The paperwork, read this way, showed the luxury room had been booked months in advance. Yet, according to the passenger manifest checked at the Southampton docks, no one ever showed up to claim it. In the formal records of this narrative, that space made its short trip across the North Atlantic in pitch darkness. No guests, no servants, no luggage. And this didn't look like a cover-up. To the investigators, it was simply the accurate bureaucratic reading of the boarding papers that survived the tragedy. Decades later, modern oceanography and engineering would provide strong technical backing for this theory through what is known as hydrostatic compression, and it is a deeply rational mechanical explanation. When the metal Leviathan plunged toward the ocean floor, the freezing temperatures and the brutal rapid spike in pressure caused the ship's heavy structures to undergo severe contractions. From this point of view, the wooden frame of the door and the internal components of the brass lock were crushed with such intense force that the mechanisms collapsed, accidentally triggering the locking pin. A failure brought on by the sheer wrath of nature, forever sealing a room that was already empty. There is nothing outlandish about this hypothesis. The abyssal zone has the overwhelming power needed to twist solid steel alloys as if they were tin foil. Structural deformation locking is a recognized phenomenon in deep water wreck exploration. In the simplest version of the story, the mystery would end right there. An uninhabited room and a door jammed shut by the unforgiving laws of physics, roughly 12,500 feet below the surface. And that would be the final answer, handed down from generation to generation as settled fact, if the narrative itself didn't hold pieces that absolutely refused to fit. Because when the cold, ink-printed version is placed side by side with the clues resting at the bottom of the sea, the perfection of that explanation slowly begins to crumble. What you are about to discover completely shifts the direction of this investigation. The secret of that hallway is very far from reaching its end. In 1985, the exact same year, oceanographer Robert Ballard finally located the debris field deep in the Atlantic. An equally unsettling discovery was made on dry land. Down in the basement of the company's old headquarters in the city of Liverpool, researchers found a luggage manifest that had survived the test of time. It was an internal document filled out in the days leading up to departure, focused solely on tracking trunks and heavy cargo, and there, on the line matching our supposedly empty cabin, faded ink recorded the boarding of 3 large trunks, checked in and sent straight to B-52. The owner's name was written plainly, Rovs. The shock of this discovery lies in the fact that, when cross-referencing this data with the official passenger list of that version, there is zero mention of an occupant with that last name tied to that suite. The bags made it onto the ship. They were sent to that luxury space, but the person who owned them was left off the main records, as if their identity had to be erased from public scrutiny. Understanding how the bureaucracy operated, how passengers were physically separated, and how the ship's own engineering functioned requires looking at real documents from the era. And if you are fascinated by these behind-the-scenes visuals, by the original blueprints, the boarding passes, and the stories of artifacts pulled from the deep, I highly recommend reading the ebook, The Anatomy of the Giant Titanic. It is a complete visual dossier focused on life aboard, the technology of the time, and features over 100 exclusive facts that the ocean couldn't bury. The link to secure your copy is right below in the first pinned comment. Getting back to the records that just do not add up. If the Liverpool document planted the seed of doubt, it would be a later expedition running underwater robots that made the simple version completely fall apart. Divers mapping the hull noticed a small structural tear. It was a narrow gash, ripped into the metal by the violent stress of the plunge, but it provided a direct line of sight straight into cabin B-52. What the camera lens revealed through that crack would forever change our understanding of that room. First-class furniture was built to be heavy, stable, and to follow a very strict layout. The architectural floor plan dictated that the large reading armchairs be placed right next to the windows, allowing natural daylight to wash over the passengers during the crossing. However, the armchair in B-52 was nowhere near the window. It had been dragged into the dead center of the room, and it was turned to face the entry door, sitting less than 3 feet from the exit. The violent dynamics of a sinking ship do not drag a massive armchair covered in thick fabric and solid wood and leave it standing perfectly upright, aligned in front of a door. The rush of the sea creates chaotic turbulence, knocking furniture over, slamming pieces into corners, or tossing them around randomly. But that chair waited there, perfectly intact, suggesting a clear position of keeping watch or forming a barricade. Someone pulled it there, calculating every inch. Someone sat in the gloom of the early morning under the fading glow of the emergency lights, staring at the room's only way out. And they did so while the hallway outside was consumed by the frantic rush of the evacuation and the heavy, deafening sound of water pushing mercilessly through the lower decks. A safety lock engaged from the inside. 3 trunks checked for a ghost traveler. An armchair moved on purpose to guard the door. The idea of an empty room where a lock just happened to fail under the weight of the sea completely loses its ground. The scene, frozen in time, does not point to a whim of the ocean currents. It points to a human act, intentional and isolated. Who was inside? And what were they running from even before the ocean liner met its ultimate end? Faced with a dead end where the bureaucratic version crumbles against the deep-sea reality, the void of answers usually draws wild speculation. But we don't need to turn to myths when naval engineering and history offer us paths that are vastly more compelling. And the theories that arise split the investigation down 2 distinct fronts: the raw physics of the disaster and the unpredictable human factor. The first of these theories gains traction among British researchers dedicated to the physical state of the wreck. For them, the answer to the untouched door lies in the kinetic violence of the impact itself. The argument is that the internal safety latch was not turned by trembling fingers. Instead, it was triggered by a mechanical shockwave at the exact moment of the collision. It might sound highly unlikely that a heavy piece of brass could move on its own, but we have to grasp the sheer scale of the event. A titan weighing over 46,000 tons, was tearing forward at 22 knots. That is over 25 miles per hour, slamming into a colossal wall of ice. The strike sent a violent spasm through the ship's entire steel skeleton. In this scenario, under the sudden stress applied to Edwardian-era naval systems, the reverse hinges and brass locks could suffer a phenomenon known as inertia locking. The brutal jolt slammed the latch shut in a fraction of a second, and the armchair dragged to the middle of the room. The theory suggests the ship's severe downward tilt toward the bow caused the massive piece of furniture to slide heavily across the rug until it stopped dead in front of the exit. It is a cold, calculated theory, one that respects the unforgiving laws of physics. However, another line of thought, tied to naval historians who worked as consultants on Titanic expeditions, dives in the complete opposite direction. It ignores the brass gears and focuses squarely on the loopholes in the boarding protocols of the time. This group defends a well-known reality of the great ocean liners of the early 20th century, the luxury stowaway. Back in that golden age of sailing, it wasn't out of the ordinary for high-ranking figures, politicians on off-the-record missions, or aristocrats fleeing financial ruin to board the ship under the radar. These people did not want to be seen dining under the grand crystal chandeliers. A quiet arrangement was made with the heads of the White Star Line, and they were placed precisely in suites that showed up as vacant on the public manifests. Seen through this lens, B-52 was harboring one of these ghosts. It perfectly explains the 3 large trunks registered under the name Rothes, loaded into the cargo hold, completely bypassing the official passenger list, and the scene, preserved at the bottom of the ocean, takes on a terribly lonely shape. The secret occupant was inside his cabin when the engines fell dead silent. He felt the unnatural biting cold seep into the floorboards. He heard the watertight doors slam shut and noticed the commotion turning into outright panic out in the hallways. Perhaps he was told not to leave the room under any circumstances to protect his identity, and so he made a drastic choice. He locked the door himself. He used his own body weight to drag the reading chair, pulling it away from the window and placing it in the middle of the room, facing the entrance, creating his own personal watch post. He sat there in the dark, waiting for someone he trusted to come and get him, listening to the chaos outside as the seawater slowly began to creep through the cracks in the wood. Both hypotheses are built on solid ground. Mechanical inertia focuses on metal and gravity. The luxury stowaway embraces the dark secrets of the Edwardian elite. If the investigation stopped right here, we would have a formidable tie. But history refuses to stay quiet. An account given by a crew member who survived that freezing night tips the scales and forces us to look deeper. To tie up the loose ends of this mystery, we have to look away from the theories and search for the voices of those who walked the slanting corridors that early morning. And there is one account capable of linking the unclaimed bags to the locked door. It is the rarely discussed story of a unique survivor, the chief baker, Charles Jucken. Jucken is widely remembered for his superhuman physical endurance, surviving the freezing waters until he was pulled to safety. Yet, what makes his story crucial to our narrative is not his rescue, but his steps right before the official order to abandon ship was given. 20 minutes before the stewards began pounding on doors to wake the passengers, the mood on the lower decks was one of quiet confusion. The engines had stopped. The floor already had an undeniable slant toward the bow. The water hadn't soaked the carpets yet, but tension already hung thick in the freezing air. It was in this narrow window, in the version we follow, that Jacob had to cross B deck. And that is exactly when he saw something completely out of place. A man rushing out of Corridor B, moving with extreme urgency. The chief baker knew most of the crew, and he knew the elite passengers in that section. In his account, he was dead certain. It was a man he did not recognize. He wasn't wearing a company uniform, and he didn't hold the posture of a first-class gentleman. He was a shadow, completely out of his element, vanishing rapidly toward the upper decks before all hell broke loose. This figure, pieced together with the 3 trunks checked under the name Roth's, forms the backbone of the most gripping theory regarding cabin B-52. The room was not empty. It was hiding someone traveling completely off the books. Faced with the side-swiping impact that sealed the ship's fate, the occupant was forced into a brutal dilemma. The water was rising, and no evacuation had been called. In that total lack of information, the mind acts on pure survival instinct. The man Jacob saw running could have been the stowaway himself. After dragging the chair in a moment of extreme paranoia, he might have decided to abandon his shelter, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. The shock of the wood hitting the frame, combined with the steep tilt of the sinking ship, could have triggered the brass lock's inertia mechanism. Or, in an even darker scenario, the unknown man was just someone passing by, and the true occupant chose to stay inside. Someone who turned the safety latch with his own 2 hands and sat down in the fading light, listening to the ocean break into the hallway. We don't have the absolute proof to nail down which of these 2 realities played out. But this is the only perspective that embraces the scene at the bottom of the ocean, justifies the luggage in the hold, and aligns with the survivor's tale without throwing history out the window. The story could easily end right here, accepting that the unforgiving power of the ocean simply washed away the final pieces of this puzzle. But the fuel feeding this mystery isn't just sitting 12,500 feet underwater. It's found in what history itself insists on keeping locked away. Word has it that the full report from that expedition, the one containing the high-resolution interior images captured by the robotic camera through the cabin's side crack, was never released to the public. It remains locked up. Under a supposed preservation agreement, the complete visual dossier of cabin B-52 is sealed tight until the year 2032, a date that lines up perfectly with the centennial of the international treaty protecting the Titanic. Until then, no one outside a very tight-knit circle will ever see what that lens actually found in the dark just past that turned armchair. And that silence reaches all the way back to the original papers left on dry land. The final boarding manifest from Southampton, the very document that supposedly proved the cabin was empty. It was moved into private archives decades later, and when historians finally ran an inventory on that collection, they found a surgical gap. 3 entire pages were missing from the original logbook, the exact handwritten pages detailing the occupants of cabins B-50 to B-56. There were no footnotes, no memos from archivists explaining the disappearance. Someone at some point in the last century, decided that the information on those pages should never be read again. When we tie all these loose ends together, the picture that forms is dense and deeply unsettling. The heavy brass safety latch engaged from the inside, defying time and the crushing pressure of the North Atlantic. The three large trunks linked to the name Rothes, belonging to someone who officially never set foot on deck, and the account of Chief Baker Charles Jaugen, describing an unrecognized man sprinting away from that exact same corridor 20 minutes before the general evacuation. We grew up believing the freezing waters of that April morning dragged all the secrets of the era's greatest ocean liner down with them. Believing that time and nature had brought the story to a tragic but absolute end. However, this version of the disaster forces us to question the most basic narrative of that night. If cabin B-52 was genuinely empty, no stowaways, no hidden elite figures, no last-minute dramas locked behind its heavy wooden door, then why does our imagination insist on keeping that door shut, guarding whatever rests on the other side until 2032?